Hello and welcome to Makeup and Monarchies. I am your host, Tiffany. If you're new here, welcome. This week, we have a special guest on our episode. If you watched last week's, I talked about Alexander the Third of Scotland, and that was to kind of intro into what we're talking about today, which is the First War of Scottish Independence. It did start with Alexander's death, but this is Max, and Max is going to take us right through what happened. So welcome, Max. Thank you so much for being on with me today.
Well, thank you very much for having me, for inviting me onto this very new channel.
I'm so excited. Anytime. So
yes, as you said, we want to start off with the Scottish Wars of Independence and your video on Alexander the Third. I watched it. Very good. You already talked about quite a lot of things, so it's quite good to connect to it in this way.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, we could have talked about Alexander a lot, but I thought it was like a good way to kind of just listen to it.
Exactly.
Okay. So why did this War of Independence begin?
Mm-hmm. Well, you already mentioned it. The death of Alexander the Third is basically how it all started. But between the actual start of the Wars of Independence and Alexander's death, there's an entire decade of things that happened. And I think we should first clarify on what we mean by Wars of Independence. I think usually when people think about Wars of Independence, it's a country that is, attached to another country, and they try to get away from that, and they try to get independence from a country. But with Scotland, it's rather different, because Scotland in 1286 is an independent kingdom. It's an independent country, and it is detached from England. And the Wars of Scottish Independence are what we could say, more or less, a war to keep independence, because England tries to get into it, and at times they even take over, but in the end it is a war of independence of two different countries, where one country tries to stay independent. And with the death of Alexander the Third in 1286, which was rather tragic because nothing was sorted out, it was just overnight, really. He was on his way to his newly wedded wife, who was also pregnant, by the way, and he fell off his horse in the middle of the night and probably broke his neck and died. And there were no heirs to the throne of Scotland. He had two sons. One of them died in 1281, the other one died in 1284, and he also had a daughter. This daughter, though, she was married to Eric, the King of Norway. And they had a daughter as well, also called Margaret. And but she was only 3 years old when her grandfather died. And unfortunately, her mother also died a year before that in 1283. So there were no direct heirs. There was only Margaret of Norway, who was 3 years old at the time. And the country fell into some disputes. Edward I, the King of England, he didn't want to get involved at first into the entire matter. He was very much focused on France. He was still working with Wales. So he was at war with them, you could say, and he wanted to focus on France, essentially. So Scotland then had 6 guardians, and they were in charge of running Scotland. And they then, of course, got in touch with Eric of Norway, because he was the father of the heir to the throne of Scotland, his daughter. And he was very unsure. He didn't really want to send his daughter over to Scotland, because nothing was sorted out. It was very unstable, a very unstable environment over there. So what did they do? They came together and they contacted Edward I to, get his opinion and for him to sort it out, really. And he was in Gascony at the time, and they asked him for advice. And he also saw the situation Scotland was in. He was very good friends with King Alexander III. They weren't just friends; they were also brothers-in-law. So Edward's sister, she was married to Alexander the Third at the beginning. She then eventually died as well. They married in 1251, I think. And in 1276, Edward also did homage to Edward the First because Alexander had some lands in England as well. So Edward was also his feudal lord. And generally, England and Scotland, they had a really good relationship with each other. The nobility, they were together. There were loads of family relations, something that we would nowadays call business relations, so feudal relations as well. Also, Robert the Bruce's father, for example, so who will later become king, Robert the Bruce, his father, he fought alongside Edward the First side against the Welsh in the 1270s. Also later became Constable of Carlisle, and he was Sheriff of Cumberland, etc. So they had really good relationships. And so this triangle of negotiations then evolved. So we have Norway, we have Scotland, and we have England. And over time, they then came up with what we now call the Treaty of Salisbury or the Treaty of Bergen in 1289 and 1290. So these were two treaties, but we could more or less treat them as one. Which basically entailed that Scotland remains independent, but Margaret of Scotland, the heir to the throne, who would then later on become Queen of Scotland, she would marry Edward of Carnarvon, the son of King Edward I. Margaret then, in 1290, when everything was sorted out, she was 7 years old at the time. She was then sent over to Scotland, but she fell ill on the journey, and she landed in Orkney, in the north of Scotland on an island, and died a couple of days after she landed on Orkney. And this sent Scotland into utter carnage, you could say. All of a sudden, there were 13 nobles that were fighting for the throne of Scotland. And just before civil war broke out, those guardians again reached out to Edward I, who was supposed to decide on who's going to become King of Scotland. And then in 1291, Edward travels north to the south of Scotland to meet with the Guardians. And he then declares that, in order for him to help them out, he ought to become the Lord Paramount of Scotland. And what that means was that he was basically the feudal overlord, if you want to call it like that, who was the feudal lord of everything, but he didn't owe any feudal obligations, as in military service, for example, to Scotland, and they declined. But Edward then said, you know the situation you're in. You're on the brink of civil war. I will give you 3 weeks to decide on whether you want to take up my approach, my suggestion of becoming Lord Paramount of Scotland, and I will give you the 3 weeks, and afterwards you decide. And why 3 weeks? Because it takes an army, a large army, from the south of England, roughly 3 weeks to go all the way up to Scotland. And this is exactly what Edward did. So he went down, so he sent someone down to get the army ready, and they travelled up north. And of course the Scottish knew, and they knew the situation that they were in. And they, after those 3 weeks, accepted. And Edward I was then Lord Paramount of Scotland. This is how it all started.
So, but what was Edward's interest in it? Why was he so gung-ho on it?
Yeah, well, as I already said, Edward was not really keen on getting involved at first. But because he cared for Scotland as well, he was friends with Alexander, but probably also because it went on his nerves. He got a bit annoyed with the entire situation because he wanted to focus on France. He then got involved. Well, there are 3 approaches you could take. The first one would be a contemporary approach of the late 13th century. We have the Annals of Waverley Abbey of 1291, which basically says, well, he wanted to extend his power to Scotland, take everything in, and just be a more mighty king, more or less. A rather similar approach of today's scholars of, for example, Geoffrey Geoffrey Barrow, who also says he took advantage and basically wanted to implement his authority to Scotland, more or less, or implement his authority in Scotland. But we have to say that Geoffrey Barrows, he was a historian at St Andrews and the University of Edinburgh of Scottish history. So I don't want to say that he was biased in any shape or form, but we have to acknowledge that. And then on the other side, though, we have a hugely acclaimed scholar, Professor Sir Maurice Powick, who is a professor at the University of Oxford, who says, well, Edward actually cared for Scotland. And this is why he did it. And because he saw that all those guardians and all the people up there, they did not get a hold of the entire situation for years, not just for one instance, but they tried various times. So this is why he said, okay, if you want me to help you, you've tried multiple times, you failed multiple times, I will take charge now, and I want to get this over with because I've got other things to care for. So I think it's a mixture. Personally, I think it's a mixture of both, really. I mean, we can see when they accepted it that Edward was quite swiftly took over Scotland. So he took all the royal castles. They were taken into his care. Norham, for example, Roxburgh, Stirling as well, Greyfriars, all those castles he took. He got rid of all the Scottish officials that weren't to his taste, and he named new ones. And then on the 13th of June, 1291, all the guardians of Scotland, they pledged their allegiance to Edward I. And with everything sorted out, where he actually thought, okay, we've got everything sorted, all the legal stuff is done and dusted, I'll go back to London, I'll go down south, and I will then, in peace, you could say, because I know everything's sorted out north, I will then appoint a new king. So he goes down south, he has various meetings, and you could call them interviews, job interviews, with Scottish nobles. And he then traces back all their ancestry to the Scottish royal family and to remain. On the one side, you have John Balliol, and you also have Robert de Bruce, who's the grandfather of the later King of Scotland. Mm-hmm. And on the 30th of November 1292, a committee of 104 people, they then decide that John Balliol were to become the new King of Scotland. And Bruce wasn't amused with that, of course. He wasn't really happy with it. But this is what the situation was then. So John Balliol was then decided to become the King of Scotland, and he was crowned in late November 1292.
Okay, and while this is going on, Edward is still dealing with France, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. So he was very much into conquering France, or invading France. This was his big deal. And 2 years into his reign, he asked John Balliol for troops, for military services, because he wanted to go and invade France. Mm-hmm. And John Balliol then summoned a council in September 1294. He summoned a council to consult with his officials, with all the higher nobles in Scotland, and to Edward's surprise, they reject his proposal of sending military down south to help Edward to conquer France. And within weeks, an entire war council was summoned in Scotland. So John Balliol, he gets all the big military officials in, all the bishops, and they decide, okay, we need this council. They went straight to Philip IV of France, to the King of France. They went straight down south, and they signed a treaty, which basically meant that as soon as Edward invades France, Scotland is coming from the north and invades England. Mm-hmm. And this was a treaty that we call the Old Alliance. So the Old Alliance is essentially this treaty between Scotland in France, this military treaty. And this treaty is not just a treaty that was signed in 1295 and then is just there for a couple of years or something. This was renewed up into the 16th century. So this old alliance between France and Scotland was a major treaty at the time, major military treaty, which basically meant aid for both countries and more or less a security for Scotland and for France as well. And in order to enhance that, they then went to Norway again, to Eric, and said, "Oh, Eric, we've now got this little alliance going, but would you mind giving us some ships?" Because the Norwegians, they were famous for their ships. And they basically said, "Okay, we'll give you a couple of silver coins, and we want to have 100 ships." And Eric said, "Okay, yeah, that's fine, we can do that." And they signed the deal. It was never activated, though, because they never really needed it. But it was always there. So, and this is how this, rather famous old alliance came about.
Okay. Now, this kind of left Edward in a predicament, right? Because now he's got enemies to the south, enemies to the north. Yeah. So what happens from that?
Well, Edward, he was quite clever. So he knew about it, of course, about this treaty that they signed, his now arch enemies. And the first thing he, of course, did was to secure the border in the north. So in case he wants to go down, he wants to have a secure border to Scotland to prevent them from entering his country. So in 1296, I sometimes compare it to the Cold War over here in Europe. You had armies right next to each other. There's a border, and you have the armies that stood side to side, face to face. And they were basically just waiting for an escalation up there, which happened when just a tiny army of, I think it was 7 earls or something, they went in March 1296, they went down and tried to invade Carlisle. Just a tiny army, which then was the tipping point of the entire situation. Edward, of course, wanted retaliation. Okay, this was the tipping point. We are now going north, and he did. And England invades Scotland with the sack of Berwick. Edward then also, so he sacked Berwick. He killed hundreds and hundreds of knights. It was a bloody battle. Just a one-sided battle, though. And once Berwick was sacked, he gets a letter from the King of Scotland, from John, saying, "Okay, I withdraw my homage to you," which basically is like a declaration of war, you could say, especially in this circumstance. So the two armies, they meet the Battle of Dunbar, which is just slightly north of Berwick. Well, not nowadays slightly, so it's just a short drive, but back in the day it was quite a stretch, but it is just north of, or northwest of Berwick. At Dunbar, there was a castle which was inhabited by the Earl of March, who was English, but his wife, she was Scottish, and she allowed all her fellow Scots to take over the castle. Edward I then sent his chief lieutenant, the Earl of Surrey. He sent them north to investigate. And the Earl of Surrey was, by the way, also the father-in-law of John. So there we already had, we also had a little, family relations there. And then John sends a large part of his army to Dunbar because he wanted to keep Dunbar, of course. But the English cavalry, they remained in formation, and they pulled a little trick maneuver, you could say, where they appeared to retreat, but they didn't really. They stayed in formation. They tried to, so it appeared like they retreated, and the Scottish then just charged at them without any formation. And they were, some sources say they were absolutely obliterated, the Scots. Other sources said, well, they were victorious, the English, but it wasn't that bloody. So there's an English source that says there were over 10,000 Scots that were killed. Another one says it was only one.
Yeah.
So I don't think it was just one. It was maybe a dozen, a couple of dozen, maybe 100. We definitely know that over 100 people were imprisoned. They were taken prisoners. Edward then took the castle, and John fled north to Farfar. Now, Farfar, modern historians, they know it as the seat of the Beausoleils, so of the Queen Mother and the sister of the late Queen Elizabeth II. So she was born there, for example. Although I have to say that the castle where they now live was built 100 years later. So this didn't exist, but just to get the location. As a result of Dunbar, of King Edward sacking so many castles, John then abdicated in July, and Edward effectively took over Scotland. And he did so in a very fashionable way, in my opinion. He took the stone of Scone, so the stone of destiny, which is basically the stone that all the kings sit on when they're crowned. And it is, this was situated at, or the Scone Palace. They had the stone, and all the kings, they were crowned at Scone Palace on this stone of Scone. And he took the stone, he brought it down to Westminster Abbey, where it remained until the mid 20th century, where all the other kings, all the English kings, were then found on. We do have some, it was stolen out of Westminster Abbey, etc. It is now back at Scone Palace. By the way, a beautiful and fantastic palace with amazing scones. So whenever you're in Scotland, Scone Palace, also a beautiful garden, huge park, just fantastic. Also great to visit, great exhibition, and very much worth a visit of there. And it's not too far off Edinburgh, so you could just drive there within, I think, 1.5 hours, and you're there. It's a fantastic thing.
It's right past Stirling, right? You keep going north
Yeah.
of it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when and why, aside from a movie that came out almost 30 years ago, we know it was a big to-do, but it's a movie. When and why does William Wallace come into it?
Yes, well, William Wallace, he became famous with this movie that shall not be named. I'm not a big fan of it. It is a great movie. Yes, I'll give the directors that. It's a great movie, but if you're a historian, it's like watching your favorite pig in an abattoir. It is terrible. So William Wallace then comes in. Edward I, he is effectively the ruler of Scotland, and of course there's resistance. And this is how William Wallace and also Andrew de Moray come in. So these are basically the two leaders of the rebellions. The leaders of the resistance, they start with minor revolts, 1297, and these revolts then, they become so big that Edward personally had to send troops up to Scotland. Various castles or earls, they surrendered, especially in the Lowlands, in the Scottish Lowlands. But the troops then clashed at this very famous Battle of Stirling Bridge on the 11th of September, 1297. Although de Moray, so one half of the resistance leaders, died, the Scots were still victorious. So Wallace got all the fame of it. So in March 1298, Wallace was then named Guardian of Scotland. He wasn't crowned, but he was named Guardian. And Edward then took it upon himself and traveled to Scotland in 1298, and basically to seek revenge of Stirling Bridge. And this then happened on the 22nd of July, 1298, so a year later, the next summer, at the Battle of Falkirk. The Battle of Falkirk was, Edward was victorious, England was victorious, and Wallace disappeared. It was a major battle. It was roughly 6,000 Scots against 15,000 English. So even the dimensions, Scotland didn't really stand a chance. Edward was victorious, and Wallace he disappears. So, and also military historians, I wouldn't declare myself as a military historian, but they say that it wasn't William Wallace who was behind the victory of Stirling Bridge. Andrew de Moray, he was the tactician, he was the one who analyzed everything and who set up the army pretty much. So, but there are of course also other opinions. But in my opinion, William Wallace, also because he disappeared, we don't 100% know why he disappeared or where he disappeared, but he did, and he will come back much later. But this is where we are. And so Edward's victorious, and Scotland is basically in the hands of England again.
Okay. So now we have Scotland without a guardian, without a king, because Wallace leaves, is exiled or flees. Where does that leave everybody, and what happens after that?
Well, in come two new guardians, you could say. So we have Robert the Bruce. We already talked about his father and his grandfather, and now the real deal comes in, Robert the Bruce. And he, together with John Comyn, they become guardians of Scotland. But there's a huge but. They hated each other. They absolutely detested each other. So what they then did, they appointed the Bishop of St Andrews to be the third guardian and to mediate between the two. So to be a diplomat between those two stubborn, power-craving men. And in 1302 and 1303, Edward then started, so Edward of England then started again to, with his raids to Scotland, and with most notably the Battle of Rosslyn, for example, he took Edinburgh Castle again. And in 1304, Stirling Castle was captured again. And this meant that all Scottish strongholds around Scotland were back again in English hands. And all of a sudden, in 1305, William Wallace appears again. And we don't really know what happened to him and what he did in the meantime. We do have some letters which indicate that William Wallace tried to get the attention of Philip of France, the king, and that he wanted to get some military aid. Apparently, Philip of France, he also granted some, but it never really, it never really turned out to be the, he never really sent some troops up there. And apparently he was also seen in France, so William Wallace was, and but we don't have loads of concrete things that we can actually put our fingers on and say, okay, he was there at that time. So he basically disappeared. But in 1305, he appears again, is captured straight away, and is brought to Westminster Hall for his trial.
And he obviously, in the eyes of the English, was a traitor.
Yes.
And faced execution.
Yes.
And that went through, and it was a horrific one.
Yes, I mean traitors. They got a special treating. They got. I mean, if you were a traitor, and he pledged against it, he said, I never pledged allegiance. I never did homage to Edward I. So I'm technically not a traitor because I never followed him. So I cannot be a traitor. But of course, the judges thought different, and they declared him traitor, and he got the traitor's treatment, which was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. It wasn't hanged, really, it was strangled. So he was bound on a ladder, it was pulled up around his neck. And usually when you're hanged, you get the rope around your neck, and then you fall through a door, and then your neck breaks and you're dead, or sometimes you suffocate but you're dead. Not in this case. Traitor, he would be pulled up a ladder, so they actually have an angle. He would slowly but surely, to some degree, suffocate. And then just before the eyes close, they take his testicles, they chuck them off throw them in the fire. All this whilst he was still alive. You are then disemboweled, so they take all the intestines out, throw them into the fire, and then you're quartered. And then some parts of it, they are sent around the country, most of them to Scotland, except for the head. The head was put in tar and then, of course, displayed at London Bridge so that everyone could see what happened to the traitor. I would rather call him the arch enemy of England. What happened to him and his head.
Do you know how? I know with it was Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham, they were beheaded. This was, obviously hundreds of years later, but they were beheaded in 1542, but their heads stayed on pikes until 1546.
Yeah.
Is there any knowledge of how long Wallace's head was out there?
And not to my knowledge, no. But I would assume that it was a similar amount of time. That was usually the case, that they were there until they completely deteriorated, and usually, had all their eyes and stuff, picked out, and all the maggots just in those heads, and but I would assume that it was a similar amount of time. Yeah.
Okay, so this is going on down in England.
Yeah.
What's going on with Robert the Bruce, who's up in Scotland?
Yeah, so Robert, he's still around. Also, John Comyn, he's also still around. So the two guardians, the two elected guardians. And then John Comyn thought, okay, I will tell Edward I about Robert the Bruce's plans to take over Scotland again. But the messenger was intercepted, and Robert the Bruce found out about it. And he took Comyn and killed him on the 10th of February 1306 in a church in Dumfries, which automatically leads to the excommunication of Bruce. Still, the clergy of Scotland are behind Robert the Bruce, despite the excommunication, which led to Robert the Bruce being crowned King of Scotland at Scone Palace in April 1306. And this then, of course, led to another battle, because Edward wasn't really happy with the entire situation up there. So on the 19th of June 1306, the Battle of Methven happened, where England was victorious. And Robert the Bruce, he disappeared as well. But then the tides turned for Scotland into their favour completely, because on the 7th of July 1307, Edward I dies, and his son, Edward II, takes over. Now, Edward II, I would argue, alongside King John of England in the early 13th century, was the worst king. These two, they were absolutely terrible, and so was Edward II. He had completely different priorities. And England or France or whatever were none of them. They weren't even in the top 100. Edward I, he then appears and and all of a sudden Bruce reappears, because he sees the chance. Okay, there's a change of the crown, and we'll just try again. He won some battles, Robert the Bruce. For example, the Battle of Loudon Hill. He took Edinburgh Castle, Roxburgh, and all those strongholds in Scotland, which then, over years and years, culminated in the Battle of Bannockburn, 23rd till 24th of June, 1314, so 7 years later. All this had been going on. Various raids into England from Scotland, and all of this culminated in the Battle of Bannockburn, which is one of the, probably with the Battle of Culloden, the two major battles in Scottish and Scottish-English history. So the Battle of Bannockburn, Scotland is victorious. They retake Berwick, and all seems to be done and dusted. Now, Edward II can't really do anything about it. His army lost. He doesn't stand a chance against Scotland. He tries at some points to recaptures Scotland. There are various raids from Scotland into England, which then leads into, well, you could call it a truce in April 1320 with the Declaration of Arbroath, which means, or where they decided that Scotland stands as a sovereign nation. Then tides turn again with, the forced abdication, I always call it like that, of Edward II, when Edward III takes over, who then goes up north to Scotland to try his luck at the Battle of Stanhope, for example. This entire thing is called the Wildau Campaign, which was a very weird battle, or very weird campaign. There were various retreats from both sides, minor raids, then there were refusals to attack Scottish. They were just leaving the scene overnight all of a sudden and retreated back to Scotland after some days. And nothing was really sorted out afterwards, which then on the 1st of May 1328 culminated into the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton.
Yep.
This treaty is a major treaty in the history of Scotland because this is where England officially recognizes Scotland as a free country and as a country of itself. There's a huge but though. Robert the Bruce's son had to marry Edward III's sister. So again, you have this connection of the two kingdoms together. And with Robert the Bruce dying a year later, or I don't want to say hell breaks loose, but it gets spicy again with Scotland. There are various raids in the time being, but Scotland effectively remains independent and for tens and hundreds of years, you could say, which was introduced more or less with the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton.
Yeah, they stayed until 1707.
Yeah, more or less, with the Union of the Crown, where they then, with the Scottish king taking over England. So tides have turned in that time. Exactly.
Now, in that space of after Edward I dies and then Edward II takes over, they kind of really go after Robert the Bruce, right? They kidnap his sisters, his wife, his daughter, and they're held for how many years?
Yes. Well, effectively until Bannockburn, pretty much afterwards, until Bruce takes over fully. All his wife, his children, all of them, they are still captured, and then, well, you could say given back. It sounds quite inhumane, but they are then given back to Robert because there was no point in again, quite inhumane, keeping them as a hostage. You could say I wouldn't necessarily call them prisoners. I would call them hostages because that's effectively what they were for, as a means of pressure to Robert to give in, but he didn't. And he didn't give in because he knew that if the English would kill his family, then they first of all wouldn't have the hostages again. They wouldn't have the means of pressure to get what they want from him. So he was rather calm in this situation, also because they were treated fairly, you could say. So it wasn't like a huge underground dungeon prison cell with just bare stone floors, and they were only given bread and water. That was certainly not the case.
I'm pretty sure Elizabeth was held at the Tower too, correct?
Yeah,
like in the royal apartments.
Yeah. She was given proper treatment, good treatment, not as in what we would think nowadays as a prison treatment. But yes, she was held at the Tower of London, in the apartments. So she had an entire section of the Tower for herself, also with people working for her, so she didn't have to do her laundry or anything. So that was all sorted out for her, all the food, etc. So I don't want to say she lived quite a life there, but for a prisoner from today's perspective, she definitely did.
Yeah.
But that was rather common, that prisoners of the king, that they got a good treatment, you could say.
So what ends up happening to Robert the Bruce?
Well, he dies just a year after the Treaty of Edinburgh, Northampton was signed, and his heart. He wanted his heart to be extracted and sent to the Holy Land, and his heart was actually taken out by Sir James Douglas. It was put into a silver coffin, you could say, or silver casket, and put around Sir Douglas's neck. And he then traveled down to towards the Holy Land. He stopped in Spain, and because he was then quite good with the king there, he then helped out in the battle against the Muslims, which had taken over Spain. But unfortunately, he died there. So the heart was not taken to the Holy Land; it was brought back to Scotland, and it was then buried in Scotland at Melrose Abbey. And in the 1920s, it was dug up, it was reburied without a plaque or without a sign as saying that this is where the heart lies. It was rediscovered and reburied again. So it's back at Melrose Abbey. The viscera so the intestines of Robert the Bruce, they were also taken out, and they were buried at the Chapel of St. Serve, which is now in, I think it's called Leven Grove Park in Dumbarton. And the body of Robert the Bruce, was buried at Dunfermline Abbey, where it is now.
Yeah, and Alexander the Third, or yeah, Alexander the Third is there, his son, and
Yeah,
his wife is there as well.
yeah, exactly. Yes,
Wow.
and he got a. They brought in marble from the Middle East and built him a huge crypt and everything. So he was probably properly taken care of. The only thing that didn't turn out was his heart, which landed back in Scotland, of which I think he was quite fond of. That at least it was Scotland, not the Holy Land, but it could have been, taken by the Muslims in Spain and maybe destroyed probably.
Yeah.
But it's quite interesting when they dug up the heart, the 20s, they reburied it somewhere else, and it was rediscovered, and they opened it, of course, and they still found the tissues, human tissue, and they dated it with red carbon date, etc. And just to confirm that it was Robert the Bruce, and it fit perfectly. Also to the time, etc. Could have been any, box of heart, because that was rather common that you take out the heart and that one goes to the Holy Land, the other thing goes somewhere else, and that was rather common. So it fit with Robert the Bruce, and they reburied it. Yeah, and
I,
it's now now there is actually a plaque where you can actually see, okay, this is where the heart of Robert the Bruce is, and you can actually visit it.
yeah. And I think it's kind of like haha funny, but if they needed DNA tests, all they needed was the monarch that sits on the throne today, because every
Yeah,
monarch that England has seen comes
exactly.
from Robert the Bruce.
Yes, exactly. The those lines I mentioned at the very beginning of our video, they are direct descendants of Robert the Bruce. So Queen Elizabeth II, the late Queen, and also of course King Charles III. Now he is a direct descendant of Robert the Bruce.
So I feel like sometimes, well, not sometimes, well, I feel like they won in the end, didn't they?
Yeah,
Even though
you could
it,
say so. Yeah,
even though it's not what they thought it was going to be.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Also later on, with the Union of the Crowns, 1707, and the relations in general. I mean, they are strained to some degree nowadays. but also with Brexit, etc., and they trying to regain independence. But we definitely have to say Scotland is, you could say, the Scottish royal family is in some sort pretty much victorious. Although the English call them Germans because of their German descendants and because they had to change their name, etc. After the First World War, the Second World War. But it's Scottish blood, deeply rooted in the royal family nowadays, and yeah, they love it up there. I mean, Balmoral Castle. I mean, now this year you can actually visit it. It's quite expensive. I looked at it, but I'll definitely do it. It's a good experience. I imagine. I mean, you can walk around, not the castle grounds properly, but the highlands around it, and then the areas and parks. And it's a beautiful setting. The Queen loved it. King Charles, of course, he loves it as well. And the Queen insisted in her last days to stay up there, and yeah, to die in her beloved Scotland. And this, I think personally, is also a huge sign of showing not just affection but deeply of deep love to the country, but not just to the country itself, but also to the people and her family, her ancestors, and the history that connects these two countries. And many people forget about the history that these two countries, England and Scotland, have. And I don't want to get political on here, but I hope that Scotland remains as a member of the United Kingdom in the future. And I'm quite sure it will, hopefully.
Okay. Well, thank you, Max, so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure. I love talking about it. And thanks for inviting me again.
Anytime. I hope we get to do this again. This is really fun.
Yeah, sure. Anytime.
Well, thank you so much for watching, guys. As usual, make sure that you've subscribed and make sure that bell is rung, because if it's not, then you won't get notified when I post. If you like this episode, please hit the thumbs up, the like button down below, and yeah, leave a comment, because that boosts me in the algorithm. So that's it for this week. Next week,
Let us know what you think of William Wallace in the comments.
Yeah. Let's see what
Let's start a debate.
Yeah. Next week, I will be back with, and kind of leading out of this and getting a little bit more history on the area. I'm going to go over and we're going to do an episode on Stirling Castle, which is my favorite. So, yeah, so that's it. Thank you so much. Have a good one, and I'll see you
See you
next.
later.
Bye.